So we're going to take a look at that. But I'd like to talk to you today about a legacy of faith. And I've got my clicker here. Let's see if I can. I'm not seeing it. Well, maybe I turn it on. There we go. We're going to talk about a legacy of faith. And when you hear that word legacy, what is it that you think of? What is it that you think of? Is it your ancestors? Okay. Webster's defines it this way. It's something, it doesn't define exactly what, but it's something transmitted or received from an ancestor or predecessor from the past. Now, I'm hoping this picture comes up. There it is. It's a little, that is an old pump organ. You see the little red pedals down there at the bottom? You take these little things right here, you pull them apart, you put your feet on the pedals, and you start pumping. And it's an organ. Now, this was all the rage back in the late 1800s. This particular model belongs to me now. From around 1875, 1876. It belonged to my great-grandmother, Lassa Key. Now, on Wednesday nights, rather than meet at the church building, they would go to different people's houses. And the nights that the Wednesday night prayer meeting came to her house, they would roll this particular organ out onto the front porch. They would take off the top part, the mirror and all the fancy ornate stuff there, so that it wouldn't fall off and get broken. They would take that off, set that on the floor, and then wheel the organ out onto the front porch. And my great-grandmother would play all the songs that they would sing for their Wednesday night services. Somewhere during that time, my mother was inspired to take piano lessons as well, to learn how to play the organ. And so at, I think, 5, maybe 6 years old, she started to learn to play the piano. By the time she was a teenager, when she was 13, 14, 15, something along that, she was playing piano at her church on Sunday mornings, which is a big deal. If you grew up in the part of Kentucky I did, Sunday morning at the Baptist church, you've got to have a good piano player. It sets the tone for the entire service. And my mother, that responsibility fell on her. After talking to my mom, she informed me that my dad was a song leader in his church growing up. That was something that was new information to me. My dad and I got, later in my life, we would sit around and sing some country songs or some bluegrass songs, but we never really sang any of the spirituals or the hymns from the Baptist church that he grew up with. And I recall singing some church hymns with my mom on occasion on this particular organ. I think it was around 5th or 6th grade. And I was always amazed that she could play and sing at the same time. That's crazy, because I can't play, and let alone to try to play and sing at the same time. So that's always amazing to me when Mark starts playing and then he'll start singing over the top of it. It's like, okay, my mind doesn't work that way. I don't know why, it just doesn't, but I'm grateful for those that it does. My sons all like music. And my son Matthew has joined us a few times to help accompany with the songs that we sing. And yet my sons are not drawn to what Aviana calls Jesus music. They're not drawn to it like their mother and I are. They still have time. But Avi, oh my goodness, she can belt out all the current Jesus music that's out there on K-Love and Air One and all that other stuff. She and I have a wonderful time. Anytime we go to Walmart, Grandpa, can we listen to some Jesus music? You know it. We turn that radio on and we go. And while it's a legacy that I really didn't think about ever handing down, the closer I get to the end of this life, the more I want to ensure that my family's love for Jesus music endures. And not just Jesus music, but Jesus himself. You know, the Puritans emphasized the importance of dying well. They would often go to Philippians chapter 1, verse 20 and quote this: Christ will even now, as always, be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. As they are getting ready to die, Christ will be exalted in everything that's going to happen, in everything that has happened, everything that's happening now, and in my death, Christ will be exalted. Matthew Henry wrote this. He said, through the grace of faith though the grace of faith is of universal use throughout our whole lives, it is especially so when we come to die. Faith has its greatest work to do at last, to help believers to finish well, to die to the Lord so as to honor Him by patience, hope, and joy, so as to leave a witness behind them of the truth of God's word and the excellency of His ways. When he was on his deathbed at the age of 52, Matthew Henry said this to a friend. He said, "You've been used to take notice of sayings of dying men. You've been writing down the sayings of dying men for quite some time. This is mine. That a life spent in the service of God and communion with Him is the most pleasant life that anyone can live in this world." Facing death is the acid test of our faith. Will our faith sustain us during this time? As the author of Hebrews gives us multiple examples of those who lived and died in faith. He briefly mentions Jacob, Isaac, and Joseph, not in that order, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And he calls attention to incidents from each man's life just before they died. As they faced death, none of God's promises were near fulfillment. Circumstances seemed contrary to their fulfillment. These men had lived all their lives hearing about and believing in the promises of God. But God had not yet delivered. Even so, they all died with their faith and focus on things to come, believing that God would keep His word. And while there are some different lessons to be learned from each man, the author uses each example to drive home the same basic point. Each one died with faith in God's promises, even though circumstances seemed to contradict those promises. In the cases of Isaac and Jacob, they both had many failures in life, failures in their faith in life. But by God's grace, they crossed the finish line with a strong flourish of faith. They illustrate what Paul writes again in Philippians chapter 1, but this time in verse 6. "For I am confident of this very thing, that He who began a good work in you will perfect it until the day of Christ." If by God's grace you and I have begun the life of faith, by that same grace we will die strong in faith, testifying to others that God's promises are true in spite of our circumstances. If you've got your Bibles, turn to Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to begin in verse 21 today. And we're going to see that Isaac's blessing of Jacob and Esau shows his faith in God's promises. Chapter 11, verse 20. "By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come." The story comes from Genesis chapter 27. Isaac was old and blind. He called his favorite son Esau and requested that he bring him home some fresh game, cook it up his favorite way, and then he would bless Esau. The father's blessing involved conferring a double portion of the family inheritance on the firstborn son, coupled with the prophetic words about his future. At the birth of the twins, God had directly told Rebekah back in Genesis chapter 25, verse 23, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples will be separated from your body, and one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." Jacob, the father of the nation of Israel, was the younger. Esau, the father of the nation of Edom, was the older. And as the boys grew up, Isaac had a natural liking for Esau, whereas Rebekah had a natural favor toward Jacob. And when Mama overheard that Dad was about to confer the family blessing on the older son, she went into action with a plan to secure the blessing for her favorite son. Whether she thought she was rescuing God's prophetic word from oblivion, remember God had told her way back, the older will serve the younger. It still hasn't happened in their life. And here comes this blessing. Here comes this opportunity for Isaac to pass along the double portion and the blessing line that God had promised Abraham that through you, the nations will be blessed. Here it comes. Here comes that particular prophetic blessing. And Rebekah says, no, that belongs to my boy, Jacob, not to Esau. So they trick him. I assume you know the story, how Jacob dressed up in his brother's garments, killed a goat and skinned it and put the goat skin on his arms and other places. Can you imagine being that hairy? I mean, I've got some hair on my arm here, but I can't imagine. Has anybody ever been around goats? Man, we used to ride them like cowboys when I was growing up. They are hairy little dudes. He had this hair on his arm. He had this hair on his head. He smelled like his brother, dressed like his brother, tried to make it appear that he was his brother. And he took him a bowl of stew. Mama cooked up a bowl of stew. Jacob took it in there and they hoodwinked. They deceived Isaac. And by doing so, inadvertently or on purpose, this may be the way God had planned it from the beginning, they fulfilled God's promise. It seemed kind of sneaky, and yet God's purpose was accomplished. To his credit, when Isaac discovered that he had been deceived, he didn't revoke the blessing in anger. And nor did he put a curse on his son. Rather, he told Esau, I've blessed your brother. Yes, and he shall be blessed. In Genesis chapter 27, verse 33. Can't take it back now. Perhaps Jacob understood, or Isaac understood, the younger will rule over the older. And so we may wonder, well, how was Isaac showing faith when he was deceived? He didn't even know what he was doing. And the author doesn't go into that. We're left to speculate. And he doesn't detail the differences between the blessings on Jacob and Esau. His emphasis, however, is on the blessing itself. Isaac was acting in faith that God would fulfill the prophetic aspects of the blessings in the future. Isaac was telling his son, God swore to my father that we would be a people, that a nation would rise from us. I am giving you that blessing. I am speaking the words of God over you. Now, the story behind Hebrews 11:20, it's not a flattering one to any of the participants when we look at it, except for Isaac's faith regarding things to come. When you look at the story, Isaac seemed to be more interested in a tasty bowl of stew than in God's prophetic word, like father, like son. Remember, Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of beans. When I preached in Louisiana, it was red beans and rice because that's what they understand down there. Esau himself was a profane man who had despised his spiritual heritage. Rebekah deliberately deceived her husband and encouraged her son to lie. Jacob agreed to go along with it, taking advantage of his blind father. There seems like a whole lot of evil going on here, and yet God's intent, his purposes are still accomplished. And Isaac, even though he's being deceived, whether he knew it or not, continued to believe in that blessing. Continue to believe in the promise that God had given his father, that from you I will take you out of this land and I will give you a land that will be yours and your descendants. And your descendants will number the stars. By all accounts, there's only Isaac and Jacob and Esau. I don't know about you guys, but that's only 3. I can count a whole lot more stars than that. Isaac believed in the promise. And he spoke that promise over his sons. Despite all of our shortcomings and our failures, God's purpose is going to be fulfilled. That should not cause us to shrug our shoulders in apathy or to sin so that grace may abound. Well, God's going to get done what God wants to get done. There's nothing I can do. Might as well just sit back and watch. Or, well, I'm saved by grace, so I might as well just sin all I can. So the more I sin, the more grace I get. No, God doesn't want that either. knowing that God's promises are going to be fulfilled ought to encourage us to be faithful despite disappointments. Disappointments that we have with sinful people. Disappointments that we have in the ominous world events that are occurring around us. Disappointments with our own self when we look in the mirror and say, that's not a face I enjoy looking at. Because I know what's behind that face. I know the intent of the heart of that person in the mirror. And it's not good. Knowing that God is going to be faithful should cause us to be steadfast, immovable in God's work. Knowing that our work is never in vain. Julie spoke about that this morning. It may seem like we're up against an insurmountable opponent when it comes to foster children, when it comes to adopting children, when it comes to the way that children in our society are deemed to be, well, let's murder them before they're even born, or let's abuse them and give them away after they are born because we didn't want them to start with, or other circumstances come into play, perhaps addictions, other things. I mean, there's so many things at play. But people like Julie and Josh and Jordan and Joe and Cynthia and Grace, Julie, they don't give up. They continue to march forward. We should be the same way, whether our purpose is to help with fostering hope, or our purpose is to preach the gospel, or our purpose is to sing songs, or our purpose is to talk to our neighbor. We, in the face of insurmountable odds, should never give up. Faithful to the very end. And I was about to say the bitter end, but it's not. It's not bitter for those of us who are found in the faith. It's a rejoicing end. The battle here may be over, but the rejoicing is just about to begin. As we move into the next verse, chapter 11, verse 21, we're going to see that Jacob's blessing of Joseph's son shows his faith in God's promises. 11:22 reads this way: by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. This is recorded back in Genesis chapter 48. Jacob and all of his sons and their families had migrated to Egypt to endure the famine. And Joseph had heard that his father was ill, and he took his two young sons to visit his aged father. And Jacob recalled God's appearance to him when the Lord reaffirmed his covenant that he had made with his father Abraham. It was then that Jacob claimed Joseph's two sons for himself as heirs. In effect, this meant designating Joseph as the firstborn. Joseph would receive a double portion of the inheritance. Remember, Reuben was the natural firstborn. That's who the firstborn blessing is supposed to go to. But Reuben had given that up because of an illicit affair with his father's concubine, Bilhah. So Reuben is out. Now Joseph's two sons each receive a full portion of the inheritance. Joseph was about to bless Ephraim and Manasseh. Jacob was about to bless them, and Joseph put the older boy on Jacob's right, Manasseh here, and he puts Ephraim over here because the blessings come from the right hand. And it's customary for the eldest to be the one who's blessed. Though, if you look at his family, that wasn't customary at all. And as Jacob was about to bless Ephraim and Manasseh, he switched hands. And he put the right hand of blessing on the younger Ephraim and the left hand on the older boy, Manasseh. And Joseph is standing there and he said, Dad, I think you might have this messed up. I put the boys where they need to be. You need blessing. He goes, no, son. This is right. Taking a lesson from his own life. Because it was how many ever years earlier that his father blessed him the younger son versus blessing the older son. And the amazing thing about this is that in time, Jacob and Esau became great nations. When they met somewhere on the road, Jacob kept throwing gifts out there. He said, my brother's going to kill me. If you remember, he fled for his life because his brother was so angry. And years passed, and he knows Esau is coming, and he sends gifts, and he sends camels. He even sends his family out first. Surely my brother won't kill me seeing my wife and my children. And when Jacob and Esau finally meet, they weep. They hold on to each other. They cling to each other because what had been broken has now been reunited. Filled with joy, Esau says, it doesn't matter, brother. You and mom tricked me, but look at my life. Look at the wives I have. Look at the children I have. Look at the cattle I have, the herds, the land that I have. God has blessed me. I no longer hold this anger. Jacob, because he was known as the supplanter, said, you know what? I'll take you at your word, but there's going to be this barrier between us because I don't know that you might be lying to me. I would be lying to you. If you had done that to me, oh, I'm all smiles and giggles. And then at the right moment, I'm going to drive a knife right into your back. On his deathbed, Jacob's understanding, I finally get it now, God. I finally get it. And I'm going to bless these boys the way that my family was supposed to be blessed properly. I'm going to do it the right way. I'm going to do it the way you want me to, God. And in the end, Jacob proved to be faithful. See, God has some things that He wants us to learn from that. 3 applications, real quick. He wants us to understand that God's ways are not our ways. We look at David, the life of David. He had how many, 6 or 7 older brothers? And Samuel came to each and every one of them, each more handsome and more rugged than the one before. And he looked at him and said, no, that's not him, that's not him. And then they get to this ruddy teenager. And by ruddy, they're talking about guys with red hair and perhaps some acne, though I don't know if they had acne during that point or not. But anyway, there was something about his red hair and red skin just kind of off-putting. Didn't look like everybody else around there. God said, that's him. That's the one right there. God's ways are not man's ways. And it applies to salvation as well. Man's way is according to human choice and human merit. Good people who make the right choices, they're in heaven. Bad people who make the wrong choices, they're out. Isn't that the way we kind of treat people? Well, he's a faithful church-going member. He's there every time the doors are open. As a matter of fact, he opens those doors so fast that he's trying to create a vacuum to draw more people in. That doesn't ensure that his heart is in the right place. Another thing that I think we can learn from these stories is that as grandparents, we should seek spiritual blessing for our children above worldly success. And I struggle with this one every day. I want my sons to work. I want them to have a job. I want them to be productive members of society. I want them to work for themselves or create jobs for other people. I want them to be productive. I want them to be able to pay their own bills, to pay their car note and to be able to afford things, to be able to take care of themselves so that someday they can take care of a wife and children. I want that. And it's not wrong to want those things. But you know what I should want more than those things? Is for my sons to have spiritual awareness, to have spiritual blessings in their life, to be aware, to know who God is, to know the blessings of God, to know what salvation is, to know what peace and mercy and forgiveness are, to know what hope is all about. As parents and grandparents, that's our job. Not to train them to work, though that is part of our job, but to train them to know God. And if that's the only legacy that we leave behind is that they know God, What better legacy could we ask for? I can give them my old pickup trucks. I can give them my old die-cast cars. I can give them all my old clothes, all my old golf clubs, everything tool that I've got stored in the garage. But you know what? There will come a time when moth and rust will destroy each and every part of that. But you know what won't be destroyed? Their faith. The knowledge of who God is and what he has done for them. Jacob was ensuring that Joseph and Ephraim and Manasseh knew what Abraham had taught him. God's promises are real. We don't see it. They're real. And I think another thing that he looks at us is that God is sovereign in assigning different gifts and places to his children. I had no idea that my family and I would be moving to Texas 14 years ago. No idea. This came about. I had no idea that my father led songs at his church. That it's some, either genetically or however, God says, hey, Dave, I'd like you to lead songs too. I gave you this voice, and I know you used it for all that devil worshiping rock and roll stuff. I know you did. But your voice now is to be used for me. Each of us have different gifts. Each of us are in different places because that's where God, and whether you believe God directs your life or not, that's understandable. And if you don't believe that, then he can still use you where you are. He will absolutely use you where you are. He wants us like Jacob, like Joseph. You talk about being at the right place at the right time. Joseph, who we're going to look at in just a minute. God is sovereign, and he assigns different gifts, both spiritually and physically. And it's not my responsibility to judge yours or to be jealous of yours. It's my job as your brother and sister to encourage yours, to cultivate yours, to showcase yours for the glory of God. Jacob, in those last moments, is glorifying God. You boys will be blessed. You will continue to do what God had promised through Abraham. We will build a nation. And then we come to Joseph. Joseph's mention of the Exodus and his order about his bones show faith in God's promises. Chapter 11, verse 22. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. Both things refer to the same incident back over in Genesis chapter 50. For those who are keeping notes, I skipped over a part there. Well, that's the wrong direction. It's Jacob's worship shows faith in God's promises. We just don't have the time for me to get into that. So we'll move on to the next point. Joseph's mention of the Exodus and the order about his bones show faith in God's promises. Go back to Genesis chapter 50. As he was dying, Joseph told his brothers, who were fellow Jews, that God would bring them back to the land which he had promised. The land that he had promised to Abraham, the land that he had promised to Isaac, the land that he had promised to Jacob. And then he made them swear that they would carry his bones with them when they returned to Canaan. You see, Joseph demonstrated many instances of strong faith in God throughout his lifetime. He had resisted the seductive attempts of Potiphar's wife. He remained true to God while being imprisoned unjustly. His faith enabled him to interpret dreams on more than one occasion. He dealt in a godly manner with his brothers who had wronged him. He administered the food relief program fairly without greed. But the Hebrew author skips all these great examples of faith, and he goes to these ones at the end, and he picks out the one about Joseph's bones. And so we ask, why? Why this story? Why that aspect of his life? I think the main reason is that it shows us a man facing death at a time when God's promises seemed unlikely ever to be fulfilled. You see, God had given the promises to Abraham some 200 years before. But here were his descendants living in Egypt, not even the promised land, not even in Canaan. And they were doing quite well in Egypt at this point, thanks to Joseph. But after he died, there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. And so the Jews were put into slavery. Some 200 years after his death, they were still waiting for that. And then even after they were to leave Egypt, they had to wait another 40 years before they would occupy Canaan, the land of milk and honey. Yet Joseph makes mention, he says, when we leave this place, take my bones with you to that place God has promised. I can only imagine him looking at his sons and going, you know what, we've got the promised land coming to us, Manasseh and Ephraim, and they've got to be going scratching their heads. You mean the land that's in famine right now, that we don't even own a square foot of, that there's a cave where your grandfather is buried that we don't possess? We're going there? Whoop-de-doo, Dad. Joseph, seeing God's promises unfulfilled in his life, had the vision, and we talked about that last week, to see into the future and trust that God's promises will be fulfilled. I will make you a nation. I will give you the land. And it's not only the physical part, it's the spiritual part, because last week we talked about he looked forward to a city and a home not built with human hands. He looked forward to heaven. His son, his grandson, his son Isaac looking forward to heaven. His grandson Joseph looking forward to heaven. Jacob, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph looking forward to heaven. By doing this, he was disassociating himself with all the success that he had in Egypt. He was number 2 in all of the world. Only Pharaoh ranked higher. And Joseph was the one that Pharaoh looked to. What do we do now? He disassociated himself from Egypt and the wealth and the riches and the life of comfort and the physical blessings of that world. And he says, I'm looking forward to the spiritual blessing of being in heaven. And when we get ready to go, take my bones with you, because this is not my home. This is not the place that God has promised me and our family. And I'm certain that he instilled that into his sons, because sometime later, when they did occupy the land, his bones came and rested in the promised land. The temptations of success and comfort are often greater than the temptations faced by those in poverty. The poor man readily sees his need to trust in the Lord, but the rich man says, well, why should I trust? I've got, you fill in the blank. The story of Joseph's bones should remind us that not to put our hopes in material success, but to realize how empty riches are when we're on our deathbed, how rich we truly are if our hope is in God's promises about eternity. What does it profit to gain the whole world and lose your soul? Many years ago, I want to finish with this. Many years ago, a ship known as the Empress of Ireland went down with about 130 Salvation Army officers on board, along with many other passengers. Only 21 of the Salvation Army people survived. Of the 109 that drowned, not one had a life preserver. Many of the survivors told how these brave people, seeing that there were not enough life preservers, took theirs off, gave it to others, saying, I know Jesus, so I can die better than you can. I'm ready for death. I'm going home to the land that God has promised. A young woman was about to be operated on. I want to end with this. For throat cancer. Her chances of survival were slim, and at best she might be able to live but lose the ability to speak. Surgeon said, "We're going to begin now. Do you have anything that you'd like to say?" And for a moment, the young woman remained silent. Her lip quivered and she tried to make a sound. She tried to speak. And finally, with a calm, clear voice, she said, "Blessed be the name of Jesus." I don't know if she was ever able to speak again or not, but what more fitting last words could there be? Blessed be the name of Jesus. Faith faces death by trusting God to fulfill his future promises, even when circumstances seem to contradict those promises. And when we have the same type of faith as Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, all who died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them, having believed that they existed because God says they exist, and we're relying on faith, the reality of the goods hoped for, the proof of things unseen. May our faith be that of our forefathers, of our spiritual father Abraham, of his son Jacob, Isaac, Joseph. May God have mercy on our souls, and may we rest forever in the promise that when we put our faith in him, that we will one day sing around the throne, rejoicing with those who have gone before us in heaven with our Father. If you have a need to respond to God's message this morning, we invite you to do so. I believe Mike has a really good song for us. We're going to ask you to stand and sing as we dismiss.